Welcome to this very short lecture called We the People, a continuation of many of the things we've talked about with the Constitution. In the last lecture, we looked at ratification, the approval of the Constitution as Americans accepted this new form of government. But having a government written on paper is not the same as a government in action. You can write anything down on a sheet of paper. How you put that writing into real practice really can be different. And so the Constitution as a document and the Constitution as an actual living set of things we do are two different things. The target that this lecture will address is 2.04. One of the first things that Americans had to try to figure out was exactly what the legislative branch could do and could not do. Federalists had told Americans the legislative branch would be powerful, but it would also be limited. But there is a phrase in the Constitution that gives that legislative branch a lot of wiggle room. Normally, the legislative branch is assumed to just make laws and approve treaties. But exactly what kind of laws? And how should those treaties go about being approved? Well, one way that the legislative branch can address these open questions is through what's called the elastic clause. When Congress is considering a law, it can make laws that are considered necessary and proper to carry out its already existing powers. So just because something is not written in the Constitution doesn't mean Congress can't do it. They can make a law if it's an extension of something they already have the power to do. So the phrase necessary and proper, you have to think about, what does that mean? What is a necessary law? What's a proper law? So this gives Congress some wiggle room, which is why it's called the elastic clause. Think about the elastic in your socks or the elastic that keeps your sweatpants on. It stretches and fits your body and holds things together, which is a pretty good name then for this clause, if you think about it. That's a pretty big power to have, to make laws that are necessary and proper. And one of the things that's going to happen over time is Americans will fight and disagree over what's necessary and what's proper. And that fight continues even today. Another part of the Constitution said that the federal government would be supreme over state law. And exactly what does that mean? What is the supremacy of federal law supposed to look like? Americans had to look at every situation that came up and figure out exactly what this meant, what states could and could not do in relation to the federal government. So right off the bat, the Constitution creates a government with a little bit of wiggle room and room that allows people to read its words differently. The executive branch can enforce laws, conduct diplomacy, that is, meet with other countries, lead in war, and veto laws that he or she disagrees with, though we haven't had a she yet for the executive. That seems like a pretty straightforward list of things to do: to enforce the law, to conduct diplomacy, lead in war. Okay, makes sense. But exactly what does it mean to enforce the law? What does that look like? And how should a president conduct diplomacy? Should the president do the diplomacy himself? Should he do it through someone he sends to represent? Should that diplomacy be conducted in secret? Who should get the information based on that? Think about just the meanings of these words. They seem straightforward to us, but when you get right down to it, how you read a word influences how you put that word into practice. And so the Constitution is not as clear as we think it is. And the early Americans had to debate what the meanings of these things were. Those debates sometimes got pretty heated, and that's where the Supreme Court stepped in. The job of the judicial branch is to interpret the law. But what does that mean? Do they just read it and tell you what it means, and then you have to go on with the rest of your life based on what they say? Can you ignore them? Well, that actually ended up being a pretty important Supreme Court case in the early United States. And that case was Marbury versus Madison. It was a case that was really about, when you get down to it, who has the power to decide what the law really means. And if a law means something that is not in the same spirit as the Constitution, what do we do about that law? And who has the authority to declare that? Who has the power to decide that a law is wrong because it doesn't match the Constitution? In this particular case, the result was the Supreme Court decides that it has the power to review the constitutionality of a law. And what it will do is look at a law, look at the Constitution, and decide, do the two match? Does this law that has been written match up with what the Constitution says is acceptable? And if the Supreme Court decides a law is constitutional, then that law is good. If that law is decided to be unconstitutional, then that law is over. It's dead. It's no longer a law. This particular case, Marbury versus Madison, is incredibly important. It's so important that you will cover it again next year in your government class. It's the most fundamental case in the Supreme Court's history, because not only will the Supreme Court decide it can review federal laws if they match the Constitution, eventually they will also decide they can review state laws as well. And that goes back to the supremacy clause that's in the first set of bullet points. If the Constitution is supreme and federal law is supreme, that means that state laws that contradict the Constitution are unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court can strike down those laws. So we've got three things going on here. We've got the three branches of government listed on this particular slide, and each of those branches of government is deciding what its powers are and what the meanings of those words in the Constitution are. And as it does so, it creates conflict. And that conflict gets resolved in our Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court, at the end of the day, has the job of figuring out what matches our Constitution and what does not match our Constitution. So they are the keepers of how we should read our form of government. What does our form of government mean? What's necessary? What does supremacy mean? They're the ones who get to decide that by deciding if something is constitutional or not. In many ways, the Supreme Court has the last word. It's like when you go home and figure out which of your parents gets the final say. If that happens in your household, I don't know. Sometimes parents make decisions together. Whoever that parent is, that's like the Supreme Court. If they're the ones that like make the final decision, that's what the Supreme Court does. So that's the key thing about this particular slide here. Early Americans had to figure out what the meaning of their government was, what the words mean, and in the end, the Supreme Court is going to be the one that makes those decisions. A second thing that happens in the early American government is something that the Anti-Federalists asked for: a Bill of Rights. One of the things that the Anti-Federalists criticized the Constitution for was that it did not list the rights of people to be protected from their government. And so one of the first things that happens in 1790 and 1791 is that the Federalists write up a Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights is really important for your rights and my rights as Americans. And we constantly debate what these rights mean, because they're things like freedom of speech, freedom of worship, your freedom to be tried by a jury of your peers. So these words that exist in the Bill of Rights, we do debate what they mean. However, that doesn't ignore, or that doesn't overshadow how important they are. The other thing that we want to sort of keep in mind for them is that none of them are really new. The Bill of Rights come from the states, mostly Virginia. They're mostly copied from Virginia. They come from the Northwest Ordinance, which actually is pretty much copied from Virginia, and colonial experience. That is, people didn't sit around and invent a whole bunch of new rights when they wrote these 10 amendments to the US Constitution. What they did was look at their past history, and they looked at what came before and said, here are a list of things that we considered important in our past. We're going to write them down as part of our new Bill of Rights. So the very first 10 amendments to our US Constitution, we hold up as a Bill of Rights based on our American experience, based on our traditions and our heritage from the English. So what are these rights? I've hinted at a couple of them. Rights like freedom of speech. Does that mean you can say anything you want, anytime you want, anywhere you want? Not exactly. Freedom of religion, the right to worship without government interference. Freedom of press. Does it mean you can publish anything you want, anytime you want? Freedom of assembly. What does that exactly mean? If you are protesting out on the streets of Columbus, is that an assembly? And under what conditions can you do that? Next year in your government class, you'll look at all the controversies about what these rights mean. You've got freedom of a trial by a jury of your peers, freedom to have a lawyer, freedom to have valid search warrants. So when the police come knocking on your door, they have gone through a process before they come to search your house. You have a freedom to not be cruelly punished. And you have a freedom to keep your property, or if it's going to be taken from you, there has to be a due process before it can be taken from you. So these freedoms are exceptionally important to modern Americans in this Bill of Rights. They come from American experience in the past. They come from English law. They come from the state constitutions. And we very much hold them near and dear to our hearts, even though we don't always agree on exactly what they mean. So you'll study that more next year in your government class. That's it for this very short lecture.